finally, language. We've talked about everything in the hominid lineage, from technology to art to bipedalism, but we have not talked about the evolution of language, and we will do so now. I have preferred to give language its own separate lecture in accordance with its significance, and to place it in the course at this point after we have gone through the basics of hominid chronology. And I do this because language is so critically important to modern humans. Language involves far more than just the conveying of information or the sending of messages. I believe, as do most scholars, that language is the way that we construct our lives and experience our lives. And I say this whether we're talking about Shakespearean language, elegant plays and poetry, or merely talking about our dinner table conversation at the end of the day. It's important to all of us. It's how we come to know others, and I would say come to know ourselves as well. In other words, language is the basis for human sociality. I try to remember to use the term language instead of speech. I don't always catch myself, but I want to, because I want to include both vocal and signed language. People can use both or either, and in either case it doesn't matter. Language shapes our world and connects us to others. Language is such a fundamental part of the human adaptation that we find ourselves sometimes addressing other beings or other objects that have no hope of comprehending or responding. I'm thinking here about talking to babies, to pets, even to machines. Let's face it, we do talk to the littlest tiny babies who cannot comprehend our words, who can't respond. Now, yes, they might be able to follow along with a voice tone or a facial expression, but they can't understand the words that we use. Well, you could say, but an infant is going to grow up and you're teaching it basically by talking to it. What about a pet? Again, the argument could be made that pets will understand voice tone. But using myself as an example, I will submit that many people will talk to animals in full complex sentences with words and meaning. For example, in my life, I have uttered sentences such as, "Now, Rabbit, you cannot keep chewing through the modem cords of my computer, so please stop." There's not much about voice tone here that we're trying to get across. I live with, in addition to a husband and daughter, 3 cats and a rabbit, and I do find myself talking to all of those creatures, knowing that they cannot respond in the same way that I'm talking to them, and that they understand only some parts of what I'm saying. You might ask yourself, those of you who are computer users, have you ever talked in a fit of rage or otherwise to your computers? Well, I think the point I'm making is obvious about the depth of our adaptation through language, that it's just what we do, no matter to whom we are speaking. Another corollary of this involves, again, the topic of children. Children learn our immensely complicated languages all around the world with little direct instruction. It appears to be relatively effortless for young infants to do this, and we don't sit them down to teach them this. How this process of language acquisition is accomplished is fiercely debated. It would be the subject of an entire course on its own. What we want to note is what I've already said, that the youngest infants, even from birth, already live in a linguistic world. I don't believe that we should make a distinction between pre-linguistic and linguistic when it comes to children. Pre-linguistic is sometimes used for the youngest children that don't yet have speech. They may babble or have facial expressions or turn-taking in a sort of pre-speech type of way. But that transition, while important for language theorists, for us, we should see it all just part of growing up in a language-filled world. The human brain, even from infancy, as I have said before, is adapted to absorb information. We are adapted to enter into relationship with our social partners, and it is through language that we do that. So a key question for biological anthropology is, at what point do we see evidence for language in the hominid lineage? 3 distinct possibilities can be envisioned to understand how language might have come about. The key thing to know is that each possibility is tied to a quite different definition of language. I want to go through the three possibilities with you and tie each one to a slightly different understanding of what language is all about. On the first view, language is unique to modern humans. It is a Homo sapiens phenomenon that evolved only with our species, and therefore it is of recent evolutionary origin. Now, typically, the definition of language that goes along with this view is that language should be equated with syntax, so that without syntax, language does not exist. The complex grammatical patterns of syntax are thus the key here. Syntax is often defined or loosely understood as word order, the order of the words that come in a sentence. But in fact, the definition that we need to use is a little bit more complicated because the full definition of syntax should involve the relationship of elements in a sentence. For example, how the clauses relate to the main part of a sentence, what kind of hierarchical relationship there is among the elements of a sentence, what modifies what. Let's take a fairly complex sentence. I'll make one up. The ape with the hurt leg that just made a gesture is the alpha male of the community. Now, I think most people can follow that sentence. It's a little bit tangled. But from a syntactical point of view, it's complicated. The syntax there are all those clauses, the parts that are embedded within other parts of the sentence, and that's what syntax is all about. On this first view of language being unique to modern humans, only the modern human brain is capable of generating and dealing with syntax. So by definition, only modern humans can have language. On this view, syntax is governed by a system of rules that are literally ingrained in the human brain. It's something that's hardwired in there. It's an instinct, if you will, to be able to see the world, deal with the world, interact with the world syntactically. So it's just as much a part of our brains as is our neocortex, the particular part of the brain most involved with thinking and cognition. So the conclusion can only be from this first possibility one of discontinuity, that modern humans are set apart from everything else in the world, including other hominids, certainly including non-human primates and any other type of animal. So there's a gap between modern humans and absolutely everybody else. What follows from this is it doesn't make sense to talk about gradual, incremental evolution of language. You either have it, hardwired rules for syntax in the brain, or you don't. It's similarly not sensible to talk about language as we know it, as if there could be some precursor type of form. This first view is very hard and fast, then, on what language is. It's pretty cut and dry. For the most part, this first view tends to be problematic for biological anthropologists. Now, of course, we know better than to make full generalizations like that, but on the average, I would say that most biological anthropologists worry about such a hard and fast view because it does not engage with evolutionary questions. It doesn't even believe that there is a search that is reasonable to undertake for precursors if we are already tying language to a human brain specifically. So let's go on with the second of our three possibilities. This is one that is more compatible with a certain type of evolutionary thinking. So number 2, language is now seen as being unique to the hominid lineage, but not necessarily just to Homo sapiens. So that earlier hominids probably did have language, and we can trace that in various ways in the fossils or the behaviors. Possibility number 2 then says, let's break away from this litmus test definition of language as being equivalent to syntax. We shouldn't make that narrow equation. A broader view of what language is all about is more compatible with evolutionary theory. Here, typically, the search is for the origins of speech, and I do use this word quite purposefully. In other words, it's much easier to look for vocal tract or brain configurations for speech, most people think, than it would be to look for some sort of gestural or signed language. This isn't to say that there are not theorists who talk about the origins of gesture and nonvocal communication, but rather that the typical search in fossil hominids has been for something that we can tie to capabilities for speech. So we're going to review a sampling of both anatomical and behavioral clues to whether hominids and which hominids might have been capable of language. These clues do range from vocal tract to brain to behavior. We'll start with the vocal tract. Now, the vocal tract is a soft tissue area of the body, primarily composed of three important structures: the tongue, the larynx, and the pharynx. The tongue is obvious. We know that the larynx is the voice box. And just to remind you of basic biology, the pharynx is the combined opening to the stomach and the lungs. Now, in almost all mammals, including cats, dogs, monkeys, apes, that kind of thing, we see that the larynx is located fairly high up in the neck or high up in the throat. And it has a particular relationship to the pharynx and the tongue that means that there are few sounds that are capable of being made. In other words, there are sounds that come out, but they're not articulated speech sounds because the larynx is high up and it does not articulate in the way with the pharynx and the tongue that is required for sharp, discrete speech sounds to be made. Biological anthropologists have analyzed the skulls of hominids and found that up until right about Homo erectus, that very same vocal tract plan was in place. So let's say for Australopithecines and Homo habilis, a mammalian-like, cat-like, monkey-like, ape-like vocal tract without the ability for sharply discriminated speech sounds. Well, you might ask, there's a problem here, isn't there? You're looking at skulls, but you're trying to trace the origins of something that's soft tissue. How does that work? Well, as it turns out, of course, we don't have Homo erectus larynxes and pharynxes. We don't find those. But there are clues in the bony structures of the skull to the position of the larynx. So if you're a real anatomical whiz, you can turn a skull over, look at the skull base, and look at small bony projections that will indicate where the larynx would have resided, so to speak, in the vocal tract. So there tends to be the view here that starting with Homo erectus, there was a so-called descent of the larynx towards its modern human position. We have a larynx located much lower down in the throat or the neck so that it articulates differently with the pharynx and the tongue to produce the speech sounds that we know of. It's interesting to note that when modern human babies are born, their larynx is actually quite high, and it descends during development in life. And this is part of the reason why they become better at articulation in their first months of life. But in any case, we have an indicator here through fossil evidence that there could have been yet another shift point at Homo erectus. However, there are some contentious facts about Homo erectus that should be entered into the record here. And we need to return for a moment to the Nario-Katome boy, the fossil dated to 1.6 million years ago, found in Kenya. That's so complete, 80% complete. One thing that researchers have focused on is the fact that this individual had a relatively small opening through the vertebrae in the back through which the spinal cord would have passed. This led them then to interpret, to look at that evidence and come up with a suggestion that the spinal cord itself would have been fairly small or thin. And from there they go on to speculate that there would have been less control by the spinal cord of the so-called intercostal muscles. These are muscles around the ribs that control breathing. If, in fact, the spinal cord was relatively weak in its control of these muscles for breathing, the view is that speech might have been compromised, that there might have not been a lot of power muscularly to produce speech. So the vocal tract evidence suggests a shift, but this other evidence of spinal cord and muscles leaves us with a type of question. Remember that the Nario-Katome boy is the single most complete Homo erectus. We don't have a lot of other fossil evidence to compare that with. There are other ways to analyze fossils as well. I'll give you just one more quick example, If you flip over a skull and you look at the skull base, there's a small opening that is called the hypoglossal canal. And it is through this small opening that the nerves run to the tongue. So they innervate or enliven the tongue. And if you measure the size of this opening, biological anthropologists have determined that the origins of speech are most likely not with Homo erectus, but only later with Neanderthal. In other words, the size of the opening gives us an understanding of how innervated, how nerve-rich the tongue would have been. So as with most everything else in anthropology, we come up with slightly different answers depending on the source of data. Yet I would say that there is still a type of convergence. We have an enormous time period of hominid evolution, and the convergence for origins of speech tends to be on Homo erectus and Neanderthal. So not on the earlier hominids, and that is interesting and important in its own right. So on the second possibility that we have spent some time talking about, significant continuity exists across at least some of the hominids in this later time period. We might also want to mention here that some of the behavior that Homo erectus and Neanderthal engaged in, we can easily speculate, shores up this idea that they might have had some type of speech. Once we're talking about things like deliberate burial, long-distance migration, it's easy to convince ourselves that, well, maybe they would have needed speech. And this is, again, a speculative thinking. But anyway, it all tends to fit together. This leaves us with possibility number 3. And here, there is an even greater extension of capabilities of language to other organisms. Here, language, or at least significant elements of it, can be found in primates. Now, it's very important to please keep in mind during this section, as I talk about this, that I'll be talking about present-day monkeys and apes, but I'm using them as stand-ins, as reference for creatures who would have lived before the evolutionary split between the African apes and the hominid lineage. We can only look at language capabilities in the modern animals that we have now. On this view, an evolutionary perspective compels us to understand that there was no major watershed, that language would have evolved quite gradually, even starting back before the hominids. So we can view language in two different ways. It's really fair of me to explain that there are two kind of sub-definitions of language within this area. In the first, language is composed of a series of traits or features. We might look at, for example, environmental reference, the idea that you can make reference to certain things in the environment. Or we might look for some type of syntax in language even. We might look for learnability of language or modifiability of language. And then we go out and we search for those things in monkey and ape communication. A slightly different view, which happens to fall more in line with my own research, is that language is not just a collection of traits, but that it's important, most important in use, that language is about dynamic change and cohesion. In other words, that language is important for what it accomplishes. And what it accomplishes is coordination of social action between partners dynamically. No matter which slightly different view of language you choose, here we go out and we look for what monkeys and apes do, and we find examples that fit both sub-definitions. You might remember that we talked earlier about the fact that some monkeys scream in ways when they're interacting that encodes information about the environment, about their social partners, or possibly about predators or about food sources. My own work with gestures in great apes, as I've discussed, shows that gestures can be used as well as vocalizations to coordinate at quite a complex and subtle level what's going on between social partners in the great apes. So either of these definitions allows us to find language or its precursors in monkey and ape populations. Now, complex non-human primate communication can be related to human language on this view by homology. In other words, we're really talking about systems that arose through shared descent. The fact is that we arise from common stock with these creatures. So the claim on this third view is that we evolved language from a very important evolutionary starting base, just as we evolved other things based on the primate grasping hand or the primate depth perception, the primate brain that we have talked about. So homology is a key corollary of the third view. Whichever one of these three possibilities seems more sensible to you, we want to conclude this section of the lecture by emphasizing one point. None of these three views wants to deny human uniqueness. None of them says that there's something about language that's so continuous with other primates that it doesn't set apart humans. So we want to be able to both at the same time account evolutionarily for the language that we use, but to recognize that it is not exactly like precursor forms. For example, as far as we know, only humans rely on large vocabularies that have specific and distinct meanings. And these words are used in very complicated, intricate ways, with long narratives and storytelling possible. My favorite candidate for a feature of language, or an aspect of language use more precisely, that only humans have, is the ability to talk about the past and the future. We can enter into conversation with others and share memories. If two people have a long history together, they can sit back and reflect about things that they shared. Or one person meeting a new friend, might want to talk about his past and bring that other person into his internal reflective world through talking about his own memories. Similarly, there is strategic planning that can go on for the future. Of course, this is very much part of human nature, to talk and plan and think about what is coming ahead. We don't think that there's a good deal of evidence showing that hominids or great apes could do this. It would be hard to know in some cases. It's easier to make that statement for great apes than it is for hominids. But this seems to be something that was quite elaborated late in the human evolutionary line. However, what I want to do is talk about a scenario of evolution of language that can still derive these unique features from a continuous base of evolution. Remember that we're working with this tricky balance. Unique features, but we don't want to make them mysterious or enigmatic, or as if they could not have been derived evolutionarily. And you'll notice that what I'm doing here is I'm clearly siding against possibility number one, in which language is syntax and is uniquely modern and only in the human brain. So I am speaking from my position as someone who writes a lot about evolution of language, my bias, if you will, that there is some type of continuity in language evolution. So when I give you a plausible scenario for language origins, as I'm about to do, I don't just pick one at random. I pick one that I like. I pick my favorite one, and it's going to reflect some continuity. The scenario for language origins and evolution that I will describe for you was created by the anthropologist Robin Sperling. And he explains in a very detailed way key steps that can get us to human language through a series of evolutionary shifts. Now, I invited Robin Sperling, along with 8 other people and myself, to an evolution of language seminar that was held in 1996. This was held at a wonderful institute in Santa Fe, New Mexico, called the School of American Research. I had written my dissertation there and was later funded by the school to bring together 10 scholars from various disciplines, various states, and various countries to come together for 5 days to talk about origins and evolution of language. And I have to tell you that there's nothing better for academics than to be flown to a beautiful city, put up and stored and housed on a beautiful campus with good food, with 5 full days of no distractions and nothing to do than to talk about something that is important to you, in this case, evolution of language. Robin Sperling came, participated, and contributed to the book that resulted from this seminar. Here's what he had to say. Sperling starts us out in this quest to really delineate the steps and origins of language with apes. He starts out at a starting point that we before have mentioned as well, and that is the iconic gesturing of apes. Sperling uses a slightly different term for iconic gesturing. He refers to it as motivated signing. but we are going to use them as equivalent terms. Iconic gesturing, motivated signing, same thing. You'll remember that iconic gestures are ones that in some way depict the action that is being made or requested. So an iconic gesture might be something like putting the arm forward and making a come here gesture, or by making a rotational turn around type of gesture in the air. The gesture depicts the action, so it's pictorial in a certain sense. Great apes can do iconic gestures, we know, and Berling calls this a very key ability that sets apart the great apes from other primates, such as monkeys, and from other animals as well. Now, there's a shift at the start of the hominid lineage that Berling finds important, and this shift relates to both increased brain size, so I am talking about Homo habilis here, not earlier Australopithecines. Homo habilis increased brain size and increased imitative capability. Oddly enough, we have found out, somewhat to our surprise, that apes are not particularly good at aping, at imitating. Some are. I wouldn't say that it's a completely absent type of skill, but for the most part, apes do not do particularly well imitating skills or gestures or vocalizations of others. So Berling envisions, as many other anthropologists do, a leap in this capability at some point in relatively early human evolution. And the key to this is the fact that it would have resulted in a reduced reliance on iconic signs. If you can imitate, then you can work towards, collectively, a conventional system where not everything has to be depicted in space, but there can just be a symbolic type of collective understanding, so that there would be increased ability to adopt utterances, whether vocal or gestural, made by social companions. Over time, then, these signs, we now will call them, these linguistic utterances, would become more and more arbitrary. In other words, not pictorial, but arbitrary, without a necessary relationship between what is uttered and the actual object or event referred to. Words could emerge, or gestures, that could begin to refer to very specific objects, events, or actions. And again, the key is to remember we're talking about social conventionalization. These hominid brains paying attention to other hominids, absorbing what others are doing, imitating, coming to a collective understanding. Eventually, then, vocabularies would have built up, and using words in orderly combinations would have become more and more beneficial. Again, we want to insert the concept of reproductive success here, that it is possible that those hominids that were able to speak and use words in this way could have improved, for example, their ability to find mates, their ability to talk about survival against predators or survival in hunting in such a way that it could have resulted in a reproductive advantage. So you get syntax at the end of this scenario emerging from all of the evolutionary steps that went before, but it is not mysterious. It does not have to be hardwired suddenly in the human brain, but rather it comes out of all the steps that were prior. Of course, Berling admits that this is in some ways speculative. Parts, however, are quite testable. The parts that I have described for you fit very nicely with both the non-human primate data and with evolutionary logic. As with all the other hypothetical scenarios we've been reviewing in this course, and there have been quite a few, this one, at the same time, both requires more data and will stimulate more research. And that's exactly what we would require a good evolutionary scenario to do. I think there is a role for scenarios like this, as I have said so many times. So I will conclude by reaffirming my particular conclusion that there has been significant continuity over evolutionary time in the development of language. And this is, again, one of those times when we really see the articulation of different sub-areas of biological anthropology, the primatology, the paleoanthropological literature and evidence, and so forth. Now, we are going to make a big transition in this course because the last chunk of lectures will turn to a very different focus. We are going to move a little bit away from the very direct consideration of our evolutionary past and move to the present. But our focus will be asking how the present has been affected by our evolutionary past. We will talk about race, human variation, evolution of human diet, and so forth. We'll begin with race in the next lecture.